Vilas, and thank you also, Mel and Dominic. You guys, I take it, are three of the many musketeers that have been responsible for putting this conference together on an annual basis. And I never had a profession like you guys. I just wonder if I might have turned out a little differently. I had folks like you steering me at such an extraordinary time in your lives as being in college time. You know, I guess you're in for a fun conference when the first speaker on the agenda is focused on genocide, war, and famine. Over lunch, no less, of course, you know, perfect timing. But I actually think the conference organizers are onto something by putting this track into the conference. Because part of securing the future, our global future, so interconnected as it is through peacemaking, through bringing existing wars, and when they morph into genocide, we bring those wars to an end and preventing new ones. It's one of the central challenges of the 21st century. Now I'm here today, my moment here in the sun of this podium, to talk about war and genocide in one particular continent. I've spent most of my adult life in Africa. 27, 28 years living and working in African war zones. So I need to issue a warning before we begin. Anyone who is sort of a gloom and doom glutton, you might not want to stick around for this lecture. Anyone who thinks that absolutely nothing can be done about some of the world's greatest challenges, well, this presentation probably isn't for you. This is maybe going to be one of the first good news lectures about African wars that's ever been given, at least in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So for those hardy souls here in the audience who are willing to suspend pre-existing notions and stereotypes, I hope that you will be rewarded. So I'm going to focus on the two variables that make me a wild optimist about Africa's long-term future. First, I want to talk about stories of transformation from Africa that involve wars and their transition to peace. And then I want to talk about the potential people's movements to make a real difference in the world. People's movements which are almost inevitably, every time, begun on college campuses, places like this all around the country. Before that, let's understand the scope of the challenge, at least what brings me here today. I'm going to focus for a second on the two biggest wars in the world, not just today, but over the last 5 or 6 decades since World War II. The two deadliest wars in the world, by far, have been the wars in Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Central Africa, and Sudan. We've seen by best estimates, and you only have wild guessing that goes on in some of these numbers that you hear, about 8 million people dead directly because of these conflicts, and millions more displaced by the conflicts. And the genocide that has occurred in at least one instance in the case of Darfur, Western Sudan. Hundreds of thousands of women and girls, sometimes very young girls, have been raped in the context of these wars. And sexual violence is used as one of the most effective, potent, intimidating tools of war that some of these parties have. And before we let it sort of drift off into something that is so far away that it's sort of unimaginable, these places are not unconnected to us. During the 1990s, many of us don't know that Osama bin Laden lived in Sudan. He was hosted by the Sudanese government, the very government that's committed the genocide in Darfur and continues to assault populations throughout the country today. He was hosted there, shared a very similar ideology. He incubated his commercial infrastructure in Khartoum, owned many businesses, construction, import, export, financed, many of you remember the attacks on our embassies in 1998 in Tanzania and Kenya, which was the first major attacks by Al-Qaeda on United States interests. So they're not so far, so not so disconnected. Congo is even more connected to every single person in this room, though most of us have no idea that we're inadvertently tied to this place. Every one of you walks around with one of these in their pockets. Every one of you has a laptop at home. Any kind of an electronic product that you use, iPads, iPods, name it. Sources, they're minerals, the raw materials that make these things work, in part from the Congo. So I simply raise these 2 points about Bin Laden and our cell phones because we aren't so far away from these places. We aren't completely disconnected. But let's move on. I want to focus on one of the reasons, I think, one of the central reasons that paralyzes us, paralyzes the world in responding to some of these terrible atrocities in war. You hear about the genocide in Darfur and the terrible war that's unfolding in Congo. And I would argue that one of the main reasons why we have not been able to muster the kind of energy necessary to respond effectively is because of the widespread belief that Africa is a hopeless continent, just filled with war and famine, basket case countries marked by tribal divisions and aging dictators. Now, this image of Africa may be partially true in a few countries in Africa, but not for the vast majority of the continent. And if we don't combat this image of Africa as a hopeless place, we will have much more trouble, I think, rallying support for real investments in ending genocide, combating and ending genocide, in stopping rape as a war weapon, in ending child soldier recruitment, some of the worst scourges of our time here in the 21st century. Now, from the headlines and the occasional television shows, news programs, Africa would certainly seem very like a hopeless place. Wow. Remember the media mantra that has driven the news media for as long as I've seen it. If it bleeds, it leads. And if you look at Hollywood's rendition of Africa, how it influences impressions and attitudes about the continent, certainly we had only that to base our thing on. Just think about the average person in America and where they're going to get their information. You would think that Africa is just a huge chasm of despair and savagery. So I wanted to take 4 examples, 4 films that have come out in the last few years and present them and contrast the message they were sending about what is happening in Africa for the purposes of the plot line and what's really happening in those countries today, and then let you decide for yourself. First case, Leonardo DiCaprio stars in the movie Blood Diamond, maybe you've seen it, which depicts Sierra Leone, a little country in West Africa, as this hell on earth, with drug-crazed child soldiers who hack off people's limbs. Now, some of that actually happened in the 1990s and early in the following decade. But it would have been good if at the end of Blood Diamond, there had been some kind of a postscript, a more elaborate postscript, that could tell the viewer that actually Sierra Leone today is a country completely at peace, with positive economic growth rates and democratic elections expressing the will of the people. It could have added that some of the rebel leaders who press ganged kids in the military service and did some of those terrible crimes, forced them to commit these terrible atrocities against their own family members, are now facing justice. And the postscript, perhaps most importantly, could have, particularly given the theme of the movie, could have educated viewers that actually Sierra Leone's former blood diamonds are now, for the most part, clean diamonds, no longer fueling one of the bloodiest wars in the world. Second case I would present to you, a few years ago, Nicolas Cage, in one of his many ill-advised moves in his movie career, played the lead role in a movie called The Lord of War. It's about he plays an arms dealer, a Ukrainian arms dealer, with a very terrible accent. who sells some of his merchandise in Liberia. So a major part of the film actually takes place in Liberia. Liberia in the film is depicted as this land of absolute savage violence. Cage's character at one point proclaims, this is the land that God has forsaken. Well, Liberia's civil war was indeed violent. Again, just like with Blood Diamond, it would have been helpful that if at the end of War, we could have had some kind of a postscript which points out that Liberia today is it's a country completely at peace, has had democratic elections, a series of democratic elections, now another one's coming in the next month for president, which resulted in this last election resulted in the first female president being elected, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, in all of Africa. She, by the way, is regularly invited to come to America and Europe to lecture governments and companies on how to get along in divided societies and organizations. The postscript for The Lord of War could have added that thousands of former child soldiers are now in rehabilitation programs, and that the man most responsible for the violence, not just in Liberia but also in Sierra Leone, for fomenting and supporting the rebels there, a guy called Charles Taylor, the former president of the country, is now in The Hague on trial for crimes against humanity. Third case I would give you is Forrest Whitaker, actually won an Academy Award for portraying Ugandan dictator Idi Amin in a movie called The Last King of Scotland. The movie depicts Idi Amin's reign of terror in an area of this country of Uganda called the Luwero tribe. Now, indeed, Idi Amin was right out of Central Castle, in one of post-colonial Africa's most murderous strongholds. But again, there was no postscript at the end of the film explaining that Uganda is a country that has emerged from this dark moment into a country that is largely consolidated peace, not just in the south and center of the country where Idi Amin was committing many of his responses, but also in the north, which had been beset for the last 20 years by violence from the conflict with the Lord's Resistance Army. So we wouldn't know without some kind of a postscript about Uganda's successes in combating issues related to HIV/AIDS. We wouldn't know about Uganda's successes on the economic growth front and on its development of a civil society and a robust press. Now, there's serious political problems and corruption issues, surely, in Uganda today. The country's moved far beyond those dark days of Idi Amin. You wouldn't know it from watching TV. Fourth, final one, and I really could go on all day about the sort of Hollywood's depiction of that. My dear friend and co-author Don Cheadle portrays very realistically a hotel manager turned rescuer, Paul Rusesabagina, in a movie that hopefully many of you have seen called Hotel Rwanda. Now, again, the film depicts very realistically the most extreme and darkest moment in that country's history during the genocide in 1994. And though the film was extraordinary in educating Americans about the phenomenon of genocide, both in Rwanda and also helping to captivate action with respect to Darfur when the film actually came out. What it could have done even more helpfully is have a postscript at the end of the movie saying Rwanda is now also a country at peace. Of course, there are political issues and questions of anti-democratic tendencies of the government in Rwanda, but you could have learned from a postscript that, in fact, Rwanda has invested very heavily in justice and reconciliation in the aftermath of the genocide. They have invested heavily in the diversity of representation in government. In fact, Rwanda now has the highest percentage of female parliamentarians, not just in Africa, but in the world, any government in the world. And that they are creating a very transparent anti-corruption culture of government. Again, political problems, like far, far beyond what the public's image is of what, and particularly reinforced by films, of what we saw in Utopia 1. The point here is that Africa is not a continent of despair or hopelessness. Scratch a little beneath the surface, and there's much of it. Most of Africa is at peace, democratized, and it's growing economically. Africa's capacity for transformation, someone who's lived there and worked there for 25 years, seems to me almost limitless. Now, in fact, Africa is not only a country full of hope, it actually isn't all that different from the rest of the world. That's what I mean by that. Remember, most African countries have only been independent states for the last, say, 50, 60 years, when the European colonial rule, era of European colonial rule finally ended. So before we judge Africa as different, why is it so violent there? We must remember that Europe fought wars of state formation. Where are the borders going to be? What kind of governments are we going to have? For 5 centuries. And there's still agitation. You know, the Balkans over the last decade ago, around the periphery of the former Soviet Union, still working on where those borders are and what kind of systems of government are going to lead the nation states that emerge. Well, Africa only has been around as nation states in the modern era for the last 60 years. So they're behind in that trajectory. Where, and only because of the colonial era and the interventions by the Europeans. That's Europe. Let's talk about here. How Africa, whether Africa is really that different from this from our own country. Where was the U.S. when we were 50 or 60 years into our independence? Well, among other things, there was a massive ethnic cleansing campaign that was occurring against Native Americans in this country. Listen to this account of an attack by English Puritans led by John Mason in Connecticut on a Native American community. I'll read it to you directly from one of the participants. What he wrote. Those that escaped the fire were slain with the sword. Some hewed to pieces, others run through with their rapiers. So they were quickly dispatched, and very few escaped. It was conceived they thus destroyed about 400 at this time. It was a fearful sign to see them thus frying in the fire, and the streams of blood quenching the same. And horrible was the stink and scent thereof, but the victory seemed to swing sad. There was also, of course, 50 or 60 years into our independence, a transatlantic slave trade that led to the abduction of approximately 30 million Africans who were sold into bondage, and a phenomenon that undergirded one of the greatest economic juggernauts in history. That period of massive economic growth in the United States of America went through during the period of time when slavery was the core of our economic system. At 50 or 60, the U.S. hadn't even fought our own Civil War, which was, of course, one of the bloodiest conflicts on a per capita basis in human history. So is Africa really all that different? Really all that hopeless? I hope you're getting the picture. We need to tell the story, I think, that Africa is not different, so different from the rest of the world. It's just going through its wars of governance and its wars of state formation at a later period in history than other continents because of that interruption of its natural historical cycle due to colonialism. Of course, Africa has had to deal with major weapons dumped by the United States, Soviet Union, now Russia, and former Soviet republics, and China were the biggest, of course, the biggest arms dealers to these African wars. So I think if we tell the true story that Africa's wars can in fact be resolved, as we've seen now from the Liberia and Sierra Leone cases and the other ones that I mentioned, and we can see that Africa really isn't that terribly different in its historical trajectory than the rest of the world, and that Africa is full of transformative examples of hope, then the effort required to give peace a chance becomes a whole lot more viable and even attractive. promised two hopeful lessons at the outset here, based on the experience that I've had. The second is the extraordinary potential of people's movements, particularly led by young folks like yourselves, in ending conflict, in stopping genocide, in making a real difference in the world. Many of the crises in Africa have ended or been diminished as a result directly of people's movements, again led by students here in the United States and around the world. The ones I already mentioned, Sierra Leone and Liberia conflicts, one of the principal ingredients for ending those wars and bringing about peace and democracy in those two countries was the Blood Diamond. When people like us in this room, all over the United States back in the late 1990s, began to learn that, in fact, our purchases of these diamonds were fueling some of the worst violence in the world in those West African countries. And the outrage directed at the companies involved, directed at governments for not acting, drove those companies and governments together into creating a system, what they call a certification system, that says, okay, any diamond you buy today, if you go into the store down, is there a downtown? Anyways, wherever you go to get jewelry around here. So I guess you got to go to Lancaster. You know for sure, because you can get a certificate of where that diamond came from. That did not exist 15 years ago. It was a free-for-all, and it incentivized these guys who had the biggest guns, who were doing the most damage to it, and they were the ones making all the money. As soon as they couldn't make money anymore from your blood diamonds, they put their guns in. They were easily defeated by the government army, and you saw a change occur. So that was directly a result of people like us in this room deciding, you know what, it's not right. No, I benefit from this thing, this phenomenon. I can get a nice reduced price diamond because of the slave labor that these guys. I'm not going to take it. I would like to know that the diamonds I purchase are actually clean. And that had transformative effects on millions of lives in West Africa, halfway around the world, places that most of us will never go. The second case of this very similar phenomenon is South Africa. For decades, as most of you know, South Africa was ruled by a system of government that was inherently racist. It discriminated against, by law, within the legal code, against non-white citizens. And over time, as people became more and more aware of this around the world, particularly in the United States, we said that's not right, and we said we're not going to do business anymore. Big industry, lots of industries in South Africa. So we're not going to do business anymore with these guys until they change their system of governance and make equal rights and equal opportunity the law of the land. And I had the honor, when I worked for President Clinton, of working with Nelson Mandela. President Mandela, when he was, after he was president, he became the lead negotiator, mediator for the peace process in Burundi, and helped bring peace to that Central African country. And we worked very closely together. He told me story after story, and all the times he would always refer back to the fact that it was those people all over America. He was always talking about the young people who stood in solidarity with him while he was in prison, with all the people that were suffering so terribly in South Africa, strengthened their hand and their resolve, and eventually helped end that apartheid system of apartheid, freed Mandela, and now we've had, just like with Liberia and Sierra Leone, a cycle of elections that have further entrenched democratic majority rule in the country. Third case I would give you is one that just occurred in the last year. After years and years of students organizing against the terrible genocide in Darfur, a new crisis emerged in Sudan. In January, this past January this year, 2011, a referendum for the independence of the southern third of the country was scheduled. So, in advance of that referendum throughout 2010, all the experts were saying, it's going to be a bloodbath, it's going to be a genocide, it's going to be another Darfur. And all the students who have been organizing and working so hard to try to ameliorate the suffering of the people in Darfur began to also expand their efforts in trying to press the Obama administration and other governments around the world to do something in advance. In the case of Darfur, it just exploded. No one knew where Darfur was. It took a whole year before the world really was able to react. And by that time, it was already full speed ahead in terms of the killing. In this case, they had advance notice. Everybody was saying, look, the trigger is going to be this referendum, this process that allows the southern people, the southern third of the country, to vote for their own independence. The North doesn't want them to leave. They're not going to let them. And I was going to kill people to stop it. So they basically said, the student movement basically pressed Obama. And when I had the opportunity to meet President Obama a number of times since he's been elected, but the last time was in October, November, right before the referendum occurred. And he had, by that time, started working on the issue. Very, very diligent. He said to us, you guys are the reason why I'm doing this. He said students, young people, particularly around this country, are demanding now, and it turned out the referendum occurred peacefully, and there's now the newest state in the world is South Sudan, and defying all the predictions of genocide and bloodshed. And that was a direct success, I think, of people caring about their neighbor even halfway around the world. There are many other examples. You think of good old Bono in the One campaign. You know, when you go to a YouTube concert, he makes you hold your cell phone up. You got to do all that texting and all this stuff to this. And what he's doing is creating a massive group of people, again, mostly young people, who are demanding that we do something about the AIDS crisis, demanding we do something about the debt crisis. And he's had tremendous success at combining grassroots activism, people all over the United States caring about an issue they would otherwise know anything about, with real change on the ground in Africa. Many examples. If you think about it, most of the major changes that have occurred, even here in the United States during the last century or more, have come about as a result of people. Think about the environmental movement, the labor movement, women's movement, particularly the civil rights movement, the peace movement. And now you have the formation of a new human rights movement. Three manifestations. One is the Sudan phenomenon I just mentioned, which is particularly young people. It started on a college campus I was at last night. I did a talk with Robin Wright, the actress at Georgetown. Well, 5 years ago, 5 or 6 young people sat in a room and created a little organization they thought would be just a local Georgetown group, and now is a national student organization called STAND, standing up against the genocide in Darfur. Now they're expanding their work. So that is one aspect of this new human rights movement that's developing, that's led by young people. The second is, and some of you have probably heard of this, and others of you will say, what is he talking about? The Invisible Children. That is this effort by us 3 young guys from California who kind of were going over to Africa to do some kind of little crazy documentary, and they ended up getting caught up in northern Uganda, found out about this terrible situation of children being abducted in the context of this war that the Lord's Resistance Army was waging against the people in northern Uganda, and have come back now and created a series of films and an organization called Invisible Children, and a movement, basically, now well over 1 million members, all under the age of 22, working assiduously to get attention to the damage that's being done by this human rights, or by this human rights catastrophe of a militia called the Lord's Resistance Army, the LRA, and they are making a big difference. We also, the Invisible Children founders, and I met with President Obama earlier last year. He was very complimentary about, again, this issue ever percolate to the inner? We don't have any sort of national security interest in the forests of Central Africa, because young people are saying, pay attention, think about what we're going on. We're about to enter, we've already entered this presidential election cycle, and the obsession in every single campaign headquarters is, what are young people thinking, and how can we demonstrate to young people that we are listening to them? So you have organizations like, and movements like the Sudan efforts, like the Invisible Children efforts, and now the newest one, which is this effort to create conflict-free campuses. Remember the story that I told you at the outset about our connection to the cell phones and that? To find college students and even some high schools are organizing to try to demand that their school at least have the aspiration that if and when these companies produce, any company produces a conflict-free cell phone, laptop, whatever kind of product that universities buy, that they're going to aspire to make their campus conflict-free as soon as possible. It doesn't legally require them to do anything, it just creates that aspiration, that positive aspiration that puts pressure on the companies, pressure on the governments to do something. So these kinds of things, when the presidential candidates get a sense of this kind of activism and activity, they want to do something about it. You have enormous potential influence when banded together, especially in this growing period of competition over the votes of young people and your market identity of these companies to try to figure out how they can impress you so you'll buy their products. And so that movement is unfolding. Now for the really good news. You can become a card-carrying member of this people's movement simply by taking an action. 5 or 10 minutes of your time, once or every once in a while, or more frequently if you're so moved by the issues that we're talking about today. I'll give you just a couple of examples of things that you can do that could actually, I think, make a real difference in the world, in the areas that we're talking about. First, just join into one of these organizations, into one of these groups. The Enough Project I work for can help you find the places you want to go, the issues that are interesting. So enoughproject.org, you can look and see what's going on and find out if there's anything that's interesting to you. But joining and getting others to join. We have however many people we have in this room times 100, because all of you now, Facebook and Twittering, I'm being very conservative, but it could be times 5. Our networks, our social networks. When we were growing up, we had like 7 people's phone numbers. I know 7 people I can call. Yeah, you guys, I mean, you want to put on a little note to your list of people that you know. You've got 5 or 6 different venues through social media that you can do so. It's remarkable. And the most, every study has shown, the biggest one I read very recently was done by one of the journals in Harvard. So the question was, what makes people react to causes? Okay, what are the things that sort of entice them into getting involved in something beyond themselves? The third, so I give you the top 3. The third most influential thing that people cited in the study was a celebrity was involved. So, okay, so they heard Angelina's interested in something, they go find out about it, and then they're like, wow, I think I'd actually like to do something about that. Second most cited influence was advertising. So a very effective ad somebody sees late at night on TV or in a newspaper or a magazine online, and they're like, you know what, I'll do something about this. This seems very compelling. But by far and away, and those were distant second and third, by far and away, the most cited reason why people got involved in causes was because a friend or family member said to them, this matters to me, and I want you to help me do something about it. Do you see the power of this? I don't, if you walk out here and never think about Central Africa again, remember this, that if you care about the environment, or if you care about, slavery or labor standards or whatever it is that you care about, the power that you have to influence other people to act, not just yourself in taking that individual action, getting others to act because you tell them, this matters to me, here's why it matters to me, here's a story that I reacted to. Now you listen to this story and tell me that it doesn't affect your heart. And then you tell them, go, let's go do this. This is the thing that if we do this week, we might actually make a difference together. You know that, you know the presidential cycles, and you know how influential the youth vote is, so that you have enormous. So when you're writing your letters to senators and you're writing letters to presidential campaigns or emails or getting on the Facebook or something, they're monitoring this. That's not Big Brother. It's just they want to get ahead of the curve. These campaigns want to know what you're thinking, so they're watching. They're watching the chat. Where it goes, they'll go. So you have, again, an influence in setting agendas rather than just following, watching. And then thirdly, as young people, you have tremendous marketing. Because these companies, if no one cares that there are sweatshops, they will go straight back to the sweatshops and start producing their clothes because it's cheaper to do it with slave labor. But if you say it's not right, then they got to change their actions. Because they're not going to sell it if they know your business, a company, Nike, whoever it is selling stuff that comes from that's from sweatshops. Similarly with this conflict minerals issue in Congo. You don't have to go to Congo. You just have to say, you know what? I don't want my purchase of a cell phone to actually lead indirectly and inadvertently to enable a militia to target young girls for rape. I'm not going to let that happen. So I'm going to tell these companies that I buy from, if you're an iPhone owner, you write a little email to Apple. It's easy. RaiseHopeForCongo.org. It's a company rankings thing on RaiseHopeForCongo.org, and you can find easy email. You can email and connect with 20 of the top electronics companies. You can see where they rank on these issues, and you can write to them and say, it's not right. Do something about it. I can't, but you can. And if you don't do something about it and somebody else does, well, I don't know. Maybe I'll just go ahead and shift my consumer loyalty somewhere else. Just the threat of that will influence behavior. Look at the power you have. So I would say the first and foremost thing is to join into something that's bigger than you and that you can find things out of. Now project's over, you get little emails. Listen, if you're doing your study, you got an exam, you got a paper due, just delete it, the email. But if you got 5 minutes, 3 minutes of time, the next 2 weeks, and this little action comes in and says, hey, just post the thing on your Facebook. Or let's all get on Senator such and such or Congressperson Y's Facebook page and say, you know what, do something about this. And suddenly he or she has, 60, 70, 100, 200 messages about this thing. They're going to do something about it. There's not a K Street lobbying firm that's sitting there saying, genocide is good. We don't have a great opponent here except apathy and indifference and ignorance. Wow, that's a great territory if you really want to make a difference somewhere. It's not like the healthcare issue or the Middle East peace process where you got huge entrenched moneyed interests. We can make a difference on these human rights questions in a big way, just cutting through the ignorance that people have about it. So one thing is just join. Second thing you can do is you can start a sister schools program. Because one of the things that I find over the years in caring about a place that's far away, if you don't have a direct connection with that place, it can get hard. You don't see an immediate change in the situation after you bring your letter. You're like, yeah, well, I did my part. Sister school initiatives, things like that, can connect you, and there's an initiative called the Darfur Dream Team. It connects schools in the United States directly with schools in the refugee camps in Darfur. You can help raise money for the camps, but you can also connect directly with video blogging and other forms of social networking directly with the refugee children, the students in these camps who have been uprooted by a genocide in Darfur, are stuck in warehouses in these camps, in these refugee camps. The international system, the United Nations system, basically can respond with food and medicine and water, barely, to keep these people alive. They don't have any money left for education. So we basically went in and said, well, we'll help by connecting the students here with students there to raise the system. It's very little amount of money it costs to educate these. So there's a way to do it by getting on DarfurDreamTeam.org if that interests you. And then a third way to get involved is, and I mentioned it already, this conflict-free campus initiative. Again, raisehopeforcongo.org. There's now in 50 or 60 universities around the country. This is the first, it just started literally like September 1st, so it's 15 days. So we have about 50 or 60 universities. We want this to be the next Blood Diamonds, where universities all across the country, students demand working with concerned, caring, committed, compassionate university board members, regents, administrators to say, you know what, it's not right, this stuff goes on. We as major purchasers of these products aspire to have conflict-free campus as fast as possible. So it puts pressure on the Apples, the Intels, the Hewlett-Packards, the Motorola's, all these companies to clean up their supply chain, clean up their act as quickly as possible. These are tangible things you can do right here at your university and make a difference by being part of this movement and doing something. And so now that we know that there are success stories and that political will indeed can be generated, it's just waiting to be pushed and pressed by you. Let's go back to the two deadliest wars in the world that began, Congo and Sudan. Through sustained diplomacy, through smart policies, we can end these tragedies. I know I've seen it, I've been part of these kinds of efforts before. It is possible. We just need your support to press the political, to affect the political will so that people that can make a difference will make it. At the senior-most levels of our government, in particular, and some of our corporate entities around this country. We don't want to send the 82nd Airborne. This isn't Iraq or Afghanistan. This is one where everyone knows the United States has, by a factor of tenfold, the largest army in the world. What many people don't necessarily know is that we also have, by far and away, the largest diplomatic group. And that we need to use, and we have tremendous experience, latent experience, in peacemaking, in negotiation, in diplomacy. We need to take just a small fraction of that and deploy it in creative ways to address these two most deadly conflicts. It's not an exaggeration I would put forth to you to conclude here. It's not an exaggeration to say that millions of lives hang in the balance of our actions. The one thing we all have is our voice. And our voices now have multiple channels, ways that we've never had before to use through social media. So let's raise our voices in the most creative way we can collectively for all the survivors in Congo and Sudan. And say as loudly as we can, not on our watch.